Hello everyone, and welcome to the next Future of video, this time featuring the lovable Greenskins that have Waaghed their way into all of our hearts. As with the former videos featuring the Dwarves and Empire, which you can find links to in the description below, the format for this video will be changes needed for current content, followed by FreeLC recommendations, followed by future DLC/FreeLC update recommendations. We'll discuss these more in detail as we approach them. Before we head into the video though, I do want to thank everyone that shared these videos on Reddit, the forums, and various Discord channels, as it seems many of the changes suggested in the Empire and Dwarf videos have been implemented into the actual game, which is just amazing. Please continue to spread these videos while also discussing your opinions on the changes I recommend in the comments below, and hopefully we can continue to make improvements to one of the best games there is. It's great that we're able to contribute and at least have a type of dialogue that CA seems to be listening to, at least a little bit. Before we get into it though, I do want to make a quick note that one of the changes I would like to see added that would be fairly easy to do is that there are a couple lords that don't have what I call unique skill tree, which is like if you look at Karl Franz or Gelt or most of the Game 2 lords, all of them have a unique tree that's usually near the top, and it's like 4 or 5 skills that are just for them. Some, like Tyrion and Malekith, have more complicated trees where they have like optional ones, and some have simpler ones like Kimmler, who has mostly just a tree that upgrades Krell. However, I do want to call attention to the units or the characters that do not have a unique tree. Which to my knowledge is Volkmar the Grim, Belegar Ironhammer, Skarsnik the Warlord of Eight Peaks, all 3 Beastmen Lords, both Wood Elf Lords, and I think the Norskin Lords. I'm not 100% on the Norskins, but the others definitely could use a looking at to give them their unique tree that really separates them from the rest of the generic Lords in single-player campaign. Obviously, this has no merit or bearing on multiplayer, but for single player it's good for characters to be customizable and have options, especially for legendary lords. You want them to feel unique and different. So that's all I want to say about that. So let's go ahead and get moving into some Greenskin stuff. Alright, to start this video off, which is going to be a long one, so buckle up and grab some tea or whatever your fancy is, we're going to look at the orkiest orc to have ever orked in Warhammer Fantasy, Grimgore Ironhide. Now, if you're not familiar with Grimgore, I'm going to sum up what he is very quickly. Grimgore Ironhide is dead-ard, as the orcs would say, meaning that he's quite literally the largest and most powerful greenskin to record. I'll put it this way. The orc warlord Gorfang Rotgut is the largest normal orc there is, and Grimgore stands a solid head taller. This is a guy who single-handedly wiped out the monstrous hordes of Hell Pit in a narrow tunnel, slaying hundreds if not thousands of nasty rat ogres and worse, until the Skaven ran out of things to throw at him. Offensively and defensively, there is no greater champion of the Greenskin race than Grimgore. His only notable flaw is that he's a horrible tactician and a worse general. So why was it important for me to go over all of that? Well, I'll tell you. Looking at the lore and even the tabletop stats of Grimgore, in which he's a terrifying fighter but has no general abilities, unlike all the other Greenskin special characters, he's meant to be the ultimate fighter. Someone whose contribution as a lord is just to smash people apart and lead from the front. Unfortunately, as time has passed, he has become weaker and weaker and weaker in Total War Warhammer, while still remaining a fair bit expensive. Grimgore has become so flimsy in battle that most other lords can overwhelm him in a fight, especially those mounted ones who are quite capable of just knocking him over repeatedly. On top of that, he just doesn't have nearly enough health and melee defense to properly survive the types of engagements he should excel in. I know Turin released a video recently featuring the worst lords in the game, and you want to guess who's on it? I won't reveal exactly where he's placed, so you can go watch the video, but I can tell you that a single unit of greatswords can rather easily kill Grimgore Ironhide, even if he uses all of his abilities and items during the fight. So let's speak concrete recommended changes, starting with multiplayer. The first thing I would recommend is removing the standard die ability off of Grimgore entirely in multiplayer, and then focusing efforts on his battle skills. To replace this leadership skill, I would give him a new ability like something called Chosen of Gork, which would improve his battle abilities by perhaps granting him splash damage or significant damage buffs, for instance. But it should be something similar in function to Ungrim's Red Ruin. If it was possible, it might even be nice to have it grant him a very powerful buff, but in exchange reduce his leadership aura, or something along those lines if possible. This would really represent his ability as being a strong leader and someone whose goal on the battlefield is just to chop people up, but he's not really good at giving orders or even worrying about the people around him. When it comes to his stats, Grimgore currently has a depressingly small health pool and melee defense compared to other lords, especially when his high cost is taken into factor. The second recommendation I would make, therefore, would be to improve his melee defense substantially and also add a solid chunk to his health pool. Grimgore should be a lord designed to charge into combat and just stay there the entire game, pushing his way towards enemy units, monsters, and characters to just wipe them out. So, building further on this idea, another thing that doesn't go in line with the style of Grimgore is his bizarrely high charge bonus of 70 for an infantry lord. Now, the idea behind it makes sense. Grimgore is very heavy and a good fighter, so it follows for him to hit like a truck on the charge and tear people up. And it kind of represents the Choppo rule from Tabletop, which is during the first round of combat, Greenskins would always get a higher strength as they flail around their choppas, just tearing people apart. But in practice, this doesn't really work, as due to Grimgore's slow speed and being trapped as an infantry-only character, he rarely gets to make use of that high charge bonus. Grimgore should be a lord that crashes in and stays put in, unlike Kazrak, for instance, who should be more about bouncing around between engagements with a high speed and charge stat. Grimgore's charge stat is one of the highest in the game for an infantry lord, and I really think it'd be wise to chop it way down in favor of more defensive stats like we spoke of above, or giving him like an anti-infantry bonus to allow him to really harm enemy elite infantry and take characters to task. Then we're on to old Gitsnik. Grimgore's axe is an alright item as it stands, but currently all it does is grant him a good chunk of melee attack and armor piercing damage, which isn't bad, but isn't all that helpful either. Taking one's melee attack from 70 to 96 may sound amazing, but with the way the game works, it's not as impactful of a change as a 220 cost axe would suggest. Plus, it's awfully redundant with the new way that Waaagh works. I would suggest that the new Gitsnik should instead increase his damage notably, and also grant a notable anti-large bonus to give him the ability to reliably damage those nasty monsters, really giving him the ability to punish characters like Kolex, Arthorial, Krokgar if they get stuck in a melee engagement with him. The final thing worth noting about Grimgore is that I honestly petition that his mass should be vastly increased, or perhaps his Chosen of Gork ability I recommended earlier should make him unable to be staggered or knocked over. So perhaps he could just have that base. He is debatably the heaviest and largest infantry character in the game, outside of monstrous infantry lords like Throg. It would be a unique twinge and really help him out overall. So to recap, Grimgore is currently one of the worst lords in the game and needs a serious tune-up. To do so, I would recommend removing his standard die ability and instead replace it with a battle buff more along the lines of Ungrim's Red Ruin ability. In addition, his mass should be increased further, or quite frankly, he should be made immune to knockdown. I mean, the guy's the size of a troll, essentially, and wears completely over-the-top ridiculous armor that would crush most creatures, but he just sort of waltzes around in it, and he's the biggest living greenskin alive. He's probably the biggest greenskin there's ever been. The only thing bigger than him that you'll ever see in greenskin armies are things that tend to tag along, like certain kinds of trolls and giants and such. His defensive stats, like health and melee defense, need to be augmented greatly, and I would also recommend a base buff of bonus versus infantry and or splash damage. Finally, Gitsnik should give an anti-large bonus instead of a melee attack bonus to better reflect the current state of the game and how Grimgore should interact with it. I like the idea of him being a fairly expensive infantry lord, but his abilities and skills should reflect that high cost, which currently they do not, unfortunately. In a somewhat similar vein to Grimgore, the generic Orc Warboss is quite the underwhelming lord choice, mainly due to being rather squishy for what should be a more tank-focused character. My recommendation would be to increase his health pool a decent bit, maybe a small increase to his melee defense, slight reduction to charge bonus on foot as it poorly combos with his speed, and it'd be nice if he could get one of his items traded out for a more exciting Greenskin themed item, like the Axe of the Last Waaagh or something from Campaign. But mainly just needs to be more durable in both his infantry and wyvern form. Though I think the boar form seems to be doing okay right now, though it could obviously benefit from some of those minor changes. That's it for him, just small little tweaks. The final legendary lord we'll be looking at in the changes to current content is the lovely Skarsnik. Now, the Warlord of Karak 8 Peaks is in a fairly odd position compared to most characters that end up on my chopping block. The reason is mainly because at face value, Skarsnik's abilities and stat lines seem pretty decent, when in reality he has some rather serious issues. Despite having charge defense against large, a fairly decent health pool, poisoned attacks, and what seems to be decent melee defense, he gets absolutely brutalized by enemy characters. Even those enemy lords on non-monstrous mounts can beat the poor Night Gobbo lord to death fairly easily. This should not be the case. So here are what I believe needs to happen. First, Skarsnik has two quality of life issues that need to get fixed. The first is that for some reason, when moving Skarsnik in a formation, the game gives him a massive berth and puts units very far away from him. This makes it extremely hard to guard him, as if you grab some units and tell them to move, his allies will all spread out, leaving the warlord badly isolated. Which, when I say that, I mean if you were to select a group of goblins and you just right click somewhere, or you right click and drag to make them go into a straight line or what have you, it will usually give him a ridiculously huge bubble. This has got to be fixed. I've also noticed this happening occasionally in some other armies. I think I've seen it happening on Scar veterans on cold ones. So it might be that there are characters that kind of have a certain size or weight class, or it might be large characters who aren't really that large. For some reason the game seems to overcompensate the space they need to have around them, and it creates these very large bubbles that, if you're trying to move in formation, can make the game much more difficult than it needs to be, and it punishes players who aren't heavily microing their units and their lords. The second thing is that Skarsnik, despite having a rather large mass in that he can't be knocked over, and he's pretty large because of Gobla, he really struggles to push through units. So, at the very least, Skarsnik needs to be able to push through units much more efficiently. And also, the game needs to not put so much space between him and allied units. But right now, he struggles to even walk through friendly units, much less enemy units. And him and Gobla should be able to push through pretty well. They should be one of the heavier lords you'll find out there, because Gobla's just freaking gigantic. So, let's move on to more normal issues. Skarsnik's stat line is just bad, quite frankly. For what is supposed to be a combined profile between him and Gobla, his melee attack, melee defense, and weapon strength are all way too low. In tabletop, Gobla's damage rivals that of a dragon, which, when you add in Skarsnik, should land him around the 450 to 500 weapon strength range. However, in Total War Warhammer, he has a weapon strength of 390. That's pretty bad. His melee defense and melee attack also leave a lot to be desired in comparison to other legendary lords. You may notice there's a theme here with the Greenskin lords, but we'll talk more about that later. His health pool and the charge defense against large seem pretty decent, but there's one crucial mechanic he really needs. Skarsnik is supposed to be the ultimate lord of ambush warfare and sneaky tactics. This is currently reflected in his ability Tricksy Traps, which grants him and nearby allies a brief 30-second speed buff and stock. Not a bad ability for him, though I do think the effect needs to last for more like 50 seconds instead of 29. With the recent changes to the Warrior Priest and Arc Lectors getting longer buff times, I think having Tricksy Traps improved to like 50 seconds would make it a much more viable option for countering gun lines and artillery that tend to just absolutely decimate Goblin lines and Greenskins in general. As the Night Goblin special character, Skarsnik, quite frankly, should just come built in with Stock and Vanguard. So I mean, if you're playing campaign, level 1, he has Stock and Vanguard. This would make him much more viable in both single player and multiplayer while synergizing well with other Night Goblin units. In addition, this would provide a valuable defense to Skarsnik, who currently has a very popular habit of being just immediately sniped out by flying lords who just stomp him into the dirt. Making the opponent work to find Skarsnik, or at least allowing Skarsnik to get very close to the brawling combats, would be fitting and provide the Greenskin player valuable seconds to advance on the opponent. And I don't think it'd be that overpowered, as the Greenskins can't take an air force, so scouting with flying units against them is a given against most Greenskins, and pretty much impossible for them to actively counter. Finally, his magic weapon, the Skarsnik's Prada, missile ability should do notably more damage, considering it's 2 uses only, has a very long cooldown, and is at a high expense of over 200 gold. There are very few items in the game that cost over 200 gold. Like, you compare Skarsnik's Prodder with Hand of the Gods, you know? So Skarsnik's Prodder definitely needs an upgrade. So to recap, Skarsnik, long story short, he needs to be able to push through other units way easier. He needs to have his melee attack, melee defense, and weapon strength at the very least improved, especially his weapon strength. He should be able to trade very nicely with lords, large lords, you know, with his anti-large bonus, that try and just isolate him. Tricksy Trap should be upgraded to around 50 seconds, or at least significantly improved. The game needs to not put so much space between him and allied units and formations automatically. The Prodder could use a damage buff. And finally, he should have Stock and Vanguard as base abilities for both single player and multiplayer. I know this would mean his skill tree would need some slight tweaking, but quite frankly, Belegar, Skarsnik, Volkmar, the Beastman Lords, and the Wood Elf Lords, as we talked about earlier, still all need unique trees added to put them on par with everyone else in the game. On Skarsnik, for instance, it'd be awesome to see. Right now, he has a Vanguard skill in campaign, and a part of me thinks that maybe that's why CA doesn't want to give him Vanguard in stock, is to them, it's like, oh, well, we want him to upgrade to that. And from what I understand, this might be wrong, but from what I understand, in multiplayer, the characters are designed or used in their base form. You're able to buy upgrades for them, like equip their magic items, or take certain abilities that, you know, exist, but for many of them, their innate abilities, like Vanguard, or their stat line, is based on how they start a campaign. So for Skarsnik, you would have to change around his skill tree, because right now the Vanguard is something that he gets later. But I honestly think it would be worth giving him Vanguard in stock to make him viable, and to make him, like, actually good, and fit his, you know, his motif. You know, Skarsnik should be someone that when you start on the battlefield, It would, if you're playing an all-night goblin army, which probably wouldn't be that amazing, but if you are playing it, you should have the ability that if your opponent doesn't have skirmishers out in the front, your army's just completely invisible at the start. Because that's amazing and awesome. And I really don't think it would be that overpowered or unbalanced. For Skarsnik's personal tree, it'd be awesome to see his Vanguard skill be replaced by him giving Vanguard to his entire army instead. Make his campaign gameplay really legitimately interesting. Right now, when you do Skarsnik in campaign, his unique ability is that he can always lightning strike to represent his ability as an ambusher. So I don't think it would be that overpowered or disinteresting for him to have the ability, if you level him up enough times. I'd probably put it at the end of his tree or just replace wherever he I forget exactly what level he unlocks it, but whatever level he unlocks Vanguard for himself, just give him Vanguard and stock base, and then just replace that with gives his entire army Vanguard. Boom, done, no problem, easy. Now, before we move on to the next section, there's one last thing I kind of want to touch on. You may notice there was kind of a theme to this section beyond the detailed update request for Skarsnik and Grimgore. And that would be that all Greenskin lords need to be notably improved in the defensive sense. Whether it's health, armor, or melee defense, they're all just way too vulnerable, especially for an army that tends to collapse when it loses its lord. I understand how they got the fairly low armor value of Orc Warbosses, for instance from their tabletop profile, which is likely where it was drawn from. But when the Dark Elf Dreadlord has an armor of 90 and a silver shield to an Orc Warboss's 70 armor with bronze shield, what? That makes no sense. Even basing it off of a tabletop perspective, indeed the Dreadlord could get a higher armor rating, but the Orc had considerably more toughness. Which the toughness stat is the ultimate can of worms for Total War Warhammer, so we'll have to cover it another time. But I'll just leave it today at saying that the Greenskin lords, mostly the Orc lords, need to be quite a bit tougher and more survivable at the least, please. Alright, and there are two last little units I want to take a look at before we move on to the FreeLC section. The first is the Crimson Killers. This Regiment of Renown is, quite frankly, just absolutely terrible and needs a thorough rebranding. The idea of a just absurdly killy unit of Black Orcs with twin dual-wielding great weapons is awesome, but currently they have too little health, too few models, and not enough defense against shooting to even stand a remote chance of being marginally effective, except for very, very specific matchups. They definitely need some serious tuning, especially as there aren't that many Orc Regiments of Renown. Most of the Regiments of Renown were based on Skarsnik and taken from a Goblin perspective. There's only, I believe, 2 Orc Regiments of Renown of the Broken Tusk Mob, who are quite good, and then the Crimson Killers, who are supposed to kind of be the ultimate infantry Orc unit. But they really need some tuning up, whether it's just more models, a lot more health per model, or just something. But they definitely could use some serious tweaking. You know, the Swords of Chaos are kind of in a similar situation where they were a really powerful unit, but they got a little too nerfed. You know, these kind of small elite guard units or elite kill units they're very difficult to balance because, you know, you kind of have to make pretty serious changes for it to be dramatic enough to change their playstyle, but it can be really easy to go too far. They don't need to be god tier. They just need to be worth their cost, and they need to be able to reliably get to the front line, which means they need to be more survivable. The last one that I'm just sort of going to toss in here is that trolls need immune to psychology. Now you may say, Sotek, why the hell do trolls need immune to psychology? That makes no sense. And here's why. In tabletop, trolls are the living embodiment of a special rule called stupidity. Stupidity was coupled with their low leadership, and basically the whole point of it was that trolls were very hard to control, and that if they weren't close to your general, they would wander off or just be idiots and just completely useless, unless you were very lucky. So Total War Warhammer kept the idea that the trolls were unreliable by giving them very low leadership, just like they have in tabletop. But the reason they had low leadership in tabletop was because it was coupled with their stupidity. And the advantage to being stupid in tabletop, the only advantage, is that stupid units were completely immune to psychology because they were too stupid to care. So trolls right now, they have an abysmal leadership, and the fact that they can be terrified just doesn't sit right with me, because A, in tabletop, if you caused fear, you were immune to terror. Terror just caused you to suffer from fear. It was kind of like there were three, there was no fear, fear, and terror. And if you were at no fear, then you suffered fear and terror. But if you were at fear, you treated terror as fear. And then if you were at terror, you didn't give a crap about anything. Make sense? So, but trolls, so first of all, they were fear causers, so they would never have just run away from terror. And second of all, that stupidity gave them immune to psych, which was super useful because it means you never have to worry about your trolls panicking or taking kind of a lot of annoying leadership penalties. So it would be really nice to see trolls get an upgrade, just a tiny one, so that they don't get terrified because they have crap leadership and some terror causer comes swooping in to cause a problem. Just small thing there. And so with that, let's go ahead and move on to the next section. Alright, we finally made it out of those trenches, so let's move on to the much more exciting realm of possible FreeLC updates. So as just a reminder, this section is dedicated to ideas that would require a small amount of work using things like existing assets, but are more intensive than just altering stats. Things that require completely new assets and such will be covered in a later section, just so we're clear. Starting in the Lords section, the first upgrade that would be an excellent addition to the game would be granting the Goblin Great Shaman his Arachnarok Spider Mount with Catchweb Spider Shrine. In tabletop, the Goblin Great Shaman was the only character capable of riding these monstrous creatures, which was quite the interesting mount. In addition, the Great Shaman unlocked a unique upgrade on the Arachnarok called the Catchweb Spider Shrine. This shrine provided the Goblin Great Shaman with the Loremaster of the Little Waaagh special rule, which in Total War Warhammer gives you a reduction to your cooldown times on spells from that lore, and it significantly boosted the Winds of Magic for the Greenskins. Adding the Arachnarok mount for the Goblin Great Shaman would be awesome on numerous levels. First and foremost, it would make the Goblin Great Shaman an interesting lord choice, as he'd be quite tanky on the Colossal Spider, while also being able to bring some serious poison damage into the fray. Secondly, for those Greenskin campaign playthroughs, it would grant the ability to run a fully Forest Goblin themed army, as currently there's no functioning lord to represent that sub-faction of the Greenskins. Finally, when it comes to multiplayer, it would allow the Goblin Great Shaman to be a competitive choice, which currently he is most certainly not. Of all the changes I'm going to be recommending in this entire section, for me, the Goblin Great Shaman getting an Arachnarok mount is personally the most important to me. The other Lord option I'd like to look at is adding either the Savage Orc Warboss or the Savage Orc Great Shaman. Honestly, the only reason they've been added to this list is because the Savage Orcs are already a notable faction in Total War Warhammer, such as the Top Knots or the Blue Serpent tribes. Currently, the lords of these factions are awkward regular orcs, or even worse, goblins. It'd be really nice to have just a generic Savage Orc Great Shaman, for instance, to give us a big Waaagh Lord caster that would be notably cheaper than Azhag, while also allowing those single-player factions to have an appropriate faction leader. Their mount options, for anyone wondering, are the Boar and Wyvern for both the caster variant and the fighter variant of the Savage Orc Lords. Which, as a quick aside, going back to the Arachnarok Goblin Great Shaman, it'd be really cool if we could get that Arachnarok mount in, because then we could have thematic Forest Goblin AI factions. So instead of just factions that build, Savage Orcs with giants, and hopefully we can get a Savage Orc or Savage Orc Shaman Lord, we could also hopefully maybe convince CA to have like the Black Venom tribe and Mount Arachnos become Forest Goblin tribes. So they have Goblin Great Shaman Lords guaranteed, they're leaders, and they build, spider units, spider riders, regular goblins, just all of those Forest Goblin units. That would be super cool. It would be really interesting and thematic. But anyway, let's move on. Moving on to the hero section, there's two we'll be looking at as possible FreeLC ideas. The most important and needed one is the Black Orc Big Boss. One thing that the Greenskins are in desperate need of is a solid, tanky fighter hero. Currently, they're functioning off an assassin class and 2 wizards, which is a fairly thin selection. A Black Orc Big Boss would be the perfect candidate to fill that need. A heavily armored warrior with excellent combat stats, the Black Orc Big Boss should come with a great weapon to provide significant armor-piercing damage, perhaps with a splash of anti-large, to give the Greenskins a strong option to consider when dealing with the recent influx of dinosaurs and constructs. He should excel in being a bruiser or trainer on the campaign map, and could use a unique ability that provides leadership to nearby orcs, perhaps have it only active in melee to make things more interesting. This would represent his Quell Animosity rule from Tabletop, where he would prevent enemy Greenskins from fighting and keep them focused on the task at hand. Finally, for his mount options, he would have either a boar or a boar chariot would be ideal. This is an ideal moment to say, by the way, it would be really nice to give the Greenskins their chariot mounts for generic lords and heroes. The Wolf Chariot would go to the Goblin Great Shaman in between his Wolf and Arachnarok mount tiers, and be the final option for the Goblin Big Boss mount tiers. So for him it would go Wolf, Gigantic Spider, Goblin Wolf Chariot. The Orc Chariot would be the middle mount option for the Orc Warboss between Boar and Wyvern, and the final mount option for the Black Orc Big Boss. Note, I didn't forget the Night Goblins or Savage Orcs, they're just not able to take chariots. So it wouldn't infest the entire roster, it would only be a minor tweak to a couple guys here and there. The second hero I'll be discussing is simply a Savage Orc Big Boss, a character focused purely on offensive damage while relying only on his frenzy and physical resistance to keep him alive. This character would make for the ideal anti-large focused monster hunter, as he comes swinging in with either a great weapon or paired hand weapons. If CA wanted to get a billion bonus points and include him with the Black Orc Big Boss, then personally I recommend making the Savage Orc Big Boss all about armor piercing and anti-large damage, while making the Black Orc Big Boss have a shield and be all about tanking with less armor piercing, but wielding an anti-infantry bonus and having a buff aura to leadership, and maybe melee attack as well. That way you would have the Black Orc Big Boss as kind of your buff-centric character who stands in the middle of the line and is very tanky, while you would have your Savage Orc Big Boss who would be running around wildly with his hair flowing in the wind, just trying to shank all the biggest, baddest monsters. If forced to choose between the two though, I personally feel that the Black Orc Big Boss would be the best option by a long shot. Alright, with characters out of the way, we can finally move on to normal units. The first thing that needs to be discussed before diving into the unit section is how Total War Warhammer treats most rosters in the game. Every single race currently in the game has every possible variety of the same troop type, with the very noticeable exception of the Greenskins. Even the Warriors of Chaos, who have a pretty dang thin roster compared to what they have in Tabletop, have multiple variants on almost all of their units. This universal law of unit variety, as I'll call it, has been applied quite well to all the rosters since the launch of Total War Warhammer, and it's high time that the Greenskins were brought up to date with this idea. Currently, there is only one melee variant for each type of orc, when in reality, most have 3. I don't think that every variant has to be included, but there are some pretty major gaps currently that deserve to be filled. The orcs and goblins are supposed to have the largest roster in the game, but many units that should have access to variants unfortunately have been sleeping on the back burner for years now. It seems that CA has decided, much to my extreme excitement, that the time has come to slowly update the Game 1 races. So it's time to talk about all the various new subtypes that should be included in the game for the Greenskins. The first new FreeLC unit idea we'll be tackling is also the most basic. One thing that the Greenskins currently really struggle with is reliable access to cheap anti-large units with a more defensive spin. So the first addition I would propose is the wonderfully simple Orc Spear Boys. Fairly cheap and crappy orcs who rely on pretty average armor and numbers to make an impact. Having a simple unit with an anti-large bonus and charge defense against large would open up many new tactics for the Greenskins when it comes to flank or artillery defense. Currently, the cheapest anti-large unit for the Greenskins is the Biggins at a whopping 800 points, which is just insanely expensive for a necessity. The Greenskins need more spear options in the 400 to 600 cost range. Honestly, I'm still surprised these guys weren't in the base game, but it's time for them to join the Waaagh! The next unit I could wax lyrical on is regular Orc Boys with dual hand weapons. Honestly, I don't think they're entirely needed, and the Biggins can remain king of dual wielding, but if it would be an easy effort, I would have an Orc Boys with dual hand weapons be a cheap anti-infantry unit that sacrifices all defense for a slightly above average offense. The next unit I'll be discussing is easily the most important one in my opinion for the unit section. Black Orcs with shields. In the age of 8th edition, it was incredibly rare to see Black Orcs not running a defensive build of sword and board that allowed them to excel in grinding style close combats. This unit would be a massive asset to the Greenskins by allowing a heavily armored unit with shields to be a solid anvil to hold the enemy down with, something the orcs are currently lacking. I'd still expect them to be more offensively focused than other heavy armor shield units that we might see in like the dwarves, but the Black Orcs deserve their most popular form to be in the game. As for dual-wielding Black Orcs, I'm 100% okay leaving that niche purely to the Crimson Killas, though as we discussed earlier, they could use some pretty serious tweaking. For the next unit, I have a fun fact for you. Did you know that Skaven aren't the only race to make use of nets in battle? Yes indeed! The other race who makes use of such nefarious tactics is none other than the Night Goblins. However, there is a difference between the two. Skaven's snare nets are designed to disable the opponent's ability to catch and hit them, whereas Night Goblin netters are designed to tangle up the opponent and reduce the damage they deal. Since nets have been introduced into the game with the rise of the Ratmen, it'd be nice to see the Night Goblins get their version as well. Whether it would be a new unit variant, like how the Fanatics are different from the normal ones, so you'd have your Night Goblin netter unit, or simply an upgrade on all Night Goblin units, that's really up to the devs. But it would be a great upgrade. Just a neat one-time ability that would reduce the weapon strength of an enemy that gets too close for a short period or something like that. It doesn't have to be crazy, but it should be in the game. It would make Night Goblins even more interesting. Which, speaking of goblins, I'm going to go ahead and toss this in here. Crossing over to the other species of melee goblins, I honestly think the regular goblin unit could use just a tiny anti-large bonus. I mean, the Skaven slaves are about as well skilled, and those ratties have some anti-large. But when I say tiny, I mean tiny, like 1 or 2, and definitely no charge defense. Goblins do not deserve charge defense. Heading back over to Orcland, I would recommend creating a common Savage Orc unit with shields. Many of you may be surprised Savage Orcs even have an option to take shields, but here we are. It'd be nice to have a touch of variety in the Savage Orc themed armies, and have some options that allow you to bring shield missile block chance to the table to augment their physical resistance save in exchange for losing some melee attack and or weapon strength. Savage Orcs with spears would also be entirely welcome, or hell, make the spear unit also the shield unit and kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Whatever, just, more variants. Come on, let's make Greenskins interesting again. The next 2 units we'll be discussing are near and dear to my heart, and are my number 2 choice for the most important unit from this list to be added via FreeLC, and that's Trolls. Contrary to what the Warriors of Chaos or Norska may want you to believe, it's actually the Greenskins who have the greatest variety of the stupid brutes. The first variant we'll be looking at is the imposing Stone Troll. Stone Trolls are the same as their common cousin, except for 2 key features. Firstly, due to their habit of consuming boulders for dinner, these rugged creatures had developed rock-hard hides capable of protecting them from quite a bit of damage. In practice, this gives them a fairly decent scaly skin save, which could be interpreted as either increasing their armor value or granting them a notable missile resistance buff, or both. The second feature gained by their rocky mutation is that stone trolls have a considerable resistance to magic. They have the second highest magic resistance tier rating in tabletop, so perhaps a 15 to 35% resistance to magic would be accurate. This combo of heavier armor and magic resistance would make them notably tougher against pretty much all comers, and would be an excellent flank unit added to the Greenskin roster. The second variant of troll is the repulsive river troll. Much like we discussed earlier, they're the exact same stat-wise as other trolls with the following exceptions. First, as the name implies, river trolls are able to move through water and marsh terrain without penalty. The most notable ability they have, however, is their horrific stench. Due to living in murky rivers and lakes that often were used as bathrooms by common folk, and consuming a diet of waterlogged and rotten meat, these creatures have an odor that's just unholy. This horrific smell grants them the river troll ability, which reduces the ability of enemies to hit them in close combat. So basically, they'd have the melee attack debuff found on the Demon Spew or the Zombie Dragon. This would make them an excellent monstrous support unit on the front lines of any Greenskin force. And I said river troll ability, I meant horrific stench ability. Switching back to the Arachnarok Spider, most may not be aware that the Chitinous Fiend actually has a catapult upgrade. Simply known as a flinger, this makeshift catapult doesn't fire boulders, but instead launches massive globs of spiderweb at the enemy units. As one might expect, this does virtually no damage, but instead entangles the foe in sticky ropes that make fighting difficult, which in tabletop was interpreted as giving the unfortunate troops always strike last. Besides the uniqueness of being a debuff weapon, the flinger was also designed so it could be fired while the Arachnarok was moving. For Total War, this would really add an interesting variant to the giant spiders, firing single large projectiles even while moving that would cause a significant reduction to melee attack of those units that it struck. Honestly, this could work either as an actual shooting attack or simply be an active ability that would be targeted onto an enemy unit. As it would do little, if any, damage, it'd add a nice goblin-y tactic to the field, so to speak, by really weakening enemy powerhouse units to give the Greenskins a noted advantage in that fight. The final FreeLC unit idea I'll be focusing on today is a special type of giant only seen rampaging alongside the Savage Orc tribes. Known by most as the Savage Giant or Savage Warpaint Giant, it's simply a giant that the Savage Orc shamans have painted up with their ritualistic tattoos. This grants a small extra defense just like it does to normal Savage Orcs, turning aside the occasional enemy strike. For Total War, this would simply be a giant with a bunch of Savage Orc paint on him that grants him a physical resistance bonus. For campaign, it should require both the giant building and the Savage Orc tree to recruit him, and would make for an excellent high-tier monster in both single-player and multiplayer. Giants are rather infamous for their paltry defenses, so one with a small physical resistance buff would be quite the star. Also, it'd provide another flavorful choice for those pesky Savage Orc AI armies. The final subspecies missing entirely from the Greenskins are the diminutive creatures called Snotlings. For those unaware, Snotlings are the smallest species of Greenskins, and their stupidity is matched only by their small stature. In battle, Snotlings can often be found gathered into swarms, wielding small rocks, sharp pieces of metal, and whatever else they can find as they attempt to overwhelm vulnerable foes. What makes them unique from other swarms, however, is their notable habit of carrying around a particularly vile fungus known as an exploding spore. These horrid weapons are gathered from greenskin dung piles, and as the name implies, when hurled, will detonate into a small toxic cloud that kills quite easily. Much like other swarms in the game, I would not recommend making them into an actual unit. Instead, I'd follow the Tomb Swarm idea and make them either into an army ability or one that can be acquired by a certain upgrade or item, called something along the lines of Snotling Exploding Spores or what have you. It'd be an explosion ability, like Brain Bursta, that would just do a significant boom of heavily armor-piercing damage after perhaps a short delay, as the projectiles come in or whatever. Or alternatively, it could be a bombardment of spores that do small damage that's 90 to 100% armor-piercing, for instance. Would be very helpful to the Greenskins in campaign, as they do tend to struggle with heavily armored foes. So as with prior Future Of episodes, both the FreeLC and DLC sections will include a proposed legendary lord to be added to that race's roster. For the Greenskins, we have a rather easy choice compared to some, as the lord for the FreeLC section is already in the game. The proposed next legendary lord for FreeLC is none other than the Squatter King himself, Gorfang Rotgut. One of the most notorious war bosses to ever stain the Badlands, Gorfang is the most dead-ard orc that's been seen since the days of old Gorbad Ironclaw. Roughly the size of a troll and covered head to toe in heavy sheets of armor, there's no Greenskin who's as tough as Gorbad. For centuries he's been around, leading the powerful Red Fangs tribe from his throne in Blackcrag. Being the most coveted stunty ruin next to Karak 8 Peaks, to hold Karak Draz for so long is quite the feat. Surprisingly, though, his most notable feature is that unlike the infamous Grimgore Ironhide, Gorfang is reputed to be quite clever. Starting with magic items, like many lords, Gorfang carries a nice combination of armor and a weapon. First, we'll look at his absurdly heavy armor set, known as the Evil Sun Armor. Made of smashed together steel plates and scale mail, the armor bears its name thanks to a large depiction of the red evil sun on Gorbad's stomach. Even the helm is unusually artistic for an orc, carved into a snarling orc's face. Just to make clear how insanely tough this armor is, Queek Headtaker once smashed Dwarf Gouger, a weapon renowned for piercing Dwarf Gromrel with ease, into Gorbad's groin with all his Skaveny might. The weapon pierced as far as it could into the most vulnerable spot on Rotgut's armor. Unfortunately for the Warlord of 8 Peaks, though, this had no effect. The Squatter King's armor is so damn thick that Queek's legendary weapon Dwarf Gouger literally couldn't reach through the sheets of steel to even scratch Rotgut. As for the actual effects of the armor, in-game, I'd suggest Gorfang have a truly absurd armor value, the highest possible for an orc. For although both him and Grimgore have mind-numbingly heavy sets, Gorfang is smart enough to wear a helmet. The second effect is that the armor was of course enchanted by Greenskin shamans to resist the effects of hostile magic. Gorfang has a significant magic resistance save, so he should be trucking a solid 35 to 50% magic resistance, perhaps. Did I mention he has a giant big old shield? That missile resistance will be really handy against some factions. Moving on to the much more famous piece of Gorfang's equipment, he wields an absurdly large serrated blade known as the Red Fang. Now, whether the Red Fang tribe was named after this blade or vice versa isn't known, as it's been passed down from chieftain to chieftain since time long forgotten. Glowing with a reddish hue that just screams danger, this blade has an eerie effect of being drawn towards the intended target like a squig out for blood. This makes it incredibly difficult to parry or avoid, and it grants Rotgut with the ability to unleash a flurry of blows unnaturally quick. Although not as brutally strong or swift as Gitsnik, Grimgore's two-handed axe, Red Fang's serrated edge is fully capable of cutting through Gromrel like paper. Backed with Gorfang's monstrous strength, there are sparingly few who stand a chance against him. When it comes to which item should have a quest battle, if any, Red Fang is 100% the more iconic and interesting choice. For its implementation, I would simply recommend an activatable ability that grants Gorfang a significant boost to his melee attack, and perhaps grant some bonus anti-infantry or magical damage. When it comes to skills, if Gorfang was added to make him different from his brethren, I would focus on defense. So to interpret this, I would suggest an ability called Dead Ard that greatly increases his defenses, perhaps like melee defense and physical resistance. Also, as a side note, he should have ludicrously high mass. Gorfang is heavier than Grimgore, which is damn impressive! Redfang itself is said to be as heavy as frickin' Gobla. The biggest note about Gorfang is that he should be the ultimate tank of an orc. High melee defense, high armor, high health, high mass, coupled with shield missile block chance and magic resistance from his armor. If Grimgore is the mother of all hammers among orcish kind, Gorfang should be the mother of all anvils. The two of them battling or teaming up should be truly epic. Plus, we're talking about an Orc Warboss here who beat Queek Headtaker in a fight. There are very, very, very few individuals who are capable of taking on Queek and surviving, much less forcing him to run away with his tail tucked between his legs, and Gorfang Rotgut is one of them. He didn't even bother wielding his actual weapons against Queek. He literally ripped a leg off of a dwarf statue and used it like a club to beat him because he couldn't be bothered to go get Redfang at the time. Moving on, Gorfang was rather notorious for being heavy as hell and preferred to fight on foot, though he did famously ride a chariot to get around faster. Honestly, he could go all the way up to a wyvern without much issue, though perhaps having an orc chariot as his ultimate mount would be more interesting. For his starting location, I would recommend putting him in Karak Azgal. It's a fair enough starting point, and he's kind of already there, so there's no real reason to move him, though he definitely should have a unique structure if he recaptures Black Crag, the Squatter King's throne. We'll discuss that later, though, in the unique structure section. Finally, when looking at faction effects, my vague advice for these, which, you know, are just thoughts, is that he should, as a faction, he should give either plus melee defense or plus leadership to all orcs across all armies. He should give plus recruitment level to orc big bosses if they're added, whether it's a black orc big boss or a savage orc big boss. And he should have he should start the game with a non-aggression pact with Skarsnik, because most people may not be aware of this, but Skarsnik and Gorfang were actually allies. They didn't really like one another, so to speak, but the two of them teamed up a bunch, and they were kind of the Gork and Mork of the Badlands, and they were kind of the ultimate duo until Grimgore got super popular and ruined everything. When it comes to Lord effects, I would give Gorfang plus recruitment rank for all non-black orcs. I would give him a bonus when laying siege to enemies to represent that he was a masterful tactician when it came to sieging settlements and finding sneaky way in. I mean, this is an orc who found a secret pathway into Karak Azul and managed to lead his warband all the way to the Karak Azul throne room, where he captured most of the royal family, shaved King Cazador's son, and crucified him on the king's throne, leaving him there, and left and didn't get caught. Gorfang is terrifying to deal with in a siege because he will find a way in. And finally, I would give him like a really strong bonus for him or just his army against dwarves, because there are very few greenskins who hate dwarves as much as Gorfang. Gorfang doesn't really care as much about Skaven or any of those other races. He cares about dwarves, and he hates them. So that's my proposal for Gorfang. Hopefully you find it interesting. Let's go ahead and move on. Alright, so the next lord that we're going to talk about in the FreeLC section, and the reason this is in the FreeLC section is because it requires some effort, is to move Azhag. Azhag the Slaughterer, in my opinion, should be moved, his starting location, to Karak Ungor, also known as Red Eye Mountain. He should be the faction leader there, and his faction should simply be the Red Eye tribe. Now, here's the reason why, before we get too far in. First of all, Azhag is originally from Troll Country, which is just a little bit to the west of the Red Eye starting place. That's where Azhag began his story. You know, he was a warboss in Troll Country. He went into the subterranean depths beneath, which is where he found the Crown of Sorcery and became Azhag as we know him today. Secondly, he actually had a very strong relationship with the Red Eye Night Goblin tribe because they were the ones who captured and gave him his beloved mount Skullmuncha, which Skullmuncha is hands down the best wyvern in the Warhammer Fantasy universe, which, granted, wyverns are still not that great, but Skullmuncha was a head above all of them, and the Red Eye Night Goblins gave her to him as a very notable gift. The next thing is that, unlike Grimgore, who also has a very strong relationship with Red Eye Mountain, because Grimgore just sort of took it over and used it as a base for a little while, Azhag, when dealing with the Red Eye Night Goblins, actually tolerated them. Grimgore literally just frickin' kills goblins wherever he sees them because he hates them. Azhag was completely and totally willing to not only put up with them, but actively recruit them into his ranks, and the Red Eye Night Goblins were one of the more powerful tribes within his Waaagh. And then another reason is that Azhag's campaign, historically, took almost the entirety of its place in the north. It's very weird having Azhag down south in the Badlands when all of his story, all of his legend, everything about him took place way up in the north, around Kislev and Troll Country and Ostermark and the northern Imperial provinces. And then another reason, tacking on, would that be that Azhag would really offer a really exciting campaign. You know, right now you basically have 3 guys in the Badlands right next to each other, where you're going to be fighting dwarves, and more dwarves, and maybe some border princes. Then you have Skarsnik, who has a very, very unique campaign, and he's over basically by, you know, Wood Elves, Bretonia, the Empire, and more dwarves. By putting Azhag in Red Eye Mountain, your main starting opponents would be the Vampire Counts, Norska, Kislev, and of course dwarves, which would be a genuinely interesting and different experience. Plus, Azhag's kind of abilities that they were pushing to have a bonus to diplomacy when dealing with other Vampire Counts due to the Crown of Sorcery, it would be much more interesting and much more applicable if he was in Karak Ungor, or Red Eye Mountain, as he would be, really close. So forging an alliance with the undead would be much more meaningful to Azhag in that position. Finally, the last reason I have is that, so the Crown of Sorcery quest item is the most important item in the game for Azhag. He is a borderline terrible character until he gets the Crown of Sorcery, because he's not as good of a fighter as most other Orc Lords, and until he gets the Crown of Sorcery, unless he gets Skullmuncha, he's pretty garbage, honestly. But the problem with the Crown of Sorcery when you start in Blackcrag is that it's so far away, because it's where he originally got it, all the way up in Troll Country in Kislev. If Azhag was put into Karak Ungor, he would start basically right next to it. So you would be able to get the Crown of Sorcery much faster, therefore getting into the much more interesting aspect of his campaign very quickly. So for lore reasons, for gameplay reasons, for quality of life reasons, it would, and just to make also him more interesting, Azhag, in my opinion, should be moved to be the faction leader of the Red Eye tribe up in Karak Ungor. And plus, that would give a nice versus campaign if people wanted to play Ungrim versus Azhag. The final note I'll make about that, though, is you may be looking and be like, but, you know, the Red Eye are the starting enemies of the, of Karak Kadrin, so are you going to just give Azhag all that territory? And I would say no. What I would recommend instead is to give Nashrak's Lair, and I forget the name of it, but the other settlement in the Karak Ungor place, I would give those 2 settlements to a AI Skaven faction, because the Skaven are kind of supposed to be all over the world, and one thing the game is really struggling with right now is that Skaven don't have much of a presence in the old world. So putting a couple of little AI Skaven factions in the mountains, so you would have, you know, the Red Eye tribe with Azhag and Karak Ungor, and then Ungrim Iron Fist with Karak Hadrin in Karak Hadrin. All those two minor settlements between them would work really, really well as Skaven settlements. And then, of course, south of that in Gunbad, you'd have the Bloody Spear tribe, and then to the west of that, you have Zufbar. I think that would make that part of the map way more dynamic and way more interesting, and would actually make contesting the mountains kind of interesting. Whereas right now, it's just kind of a slog and it sucks. So hopefully y'all agree with that. That is something I would really, really, really like to see get done. But that's it for FreeLC lords and characters and units. So it's time to step into unique buildings, which I am fond of that section. Hopefully y'all are too. Alright, so if you're new to the Future of series, we have a rather lengthy section, which I call Unique Settlements. Which basically is, whenever you look at the map, you'll notice that many settlements have a little castle symbol on them. And if you scroll over, it'll tell you you can build a unique structure here for X race. And a lot of races have a pretty prominent and impressive list. The Greenskins are not one of them. I went on to the Mortal Empires map, and I looked across the entire planet, and there were 3 Greenskin unique settlements. That is terrible. That is beyond terrible, considering how many interesting places the Greenskins live in and how many unique structures they've designed or cobbled together over the years. So this list is going to be pretty long. I'm just going to put up a static image and buckle up, ladies and gentlemen. Here we go. So going off the talk of Gorfang Rotgut earlier, he definitely needs a unique structure referring to him that Greenskins need access to. For this, I'd recommend crafting the Squatter King's throne in either his traditional home of Blackcrag or placing it in his new hideout of Karak Azgal. The Squatter King's throne should be a structure that demonstrates how Rotgut is the biggest and hardest war boss that won't tolerate no challengers. It should provide a public order bonus to the province and a smaller public order bonus to adjacent owned provinces as Gorfang keeps the lads in line. It should also provide maybe a small global bonus to raiding income, as the Squatter King was infamous for preferring extorting others to maybe not get smashed by the Red Fang tribe. So you could pass through his lands so long as you are willing to pay a tithe, or taxes, though that didn't necessarily guarantee that the orcs weren't just going to smash you anyway. To the west of Karak Azul lies the ruins of the hold once known as Karak Izrael, the City of Jewels. It fell long ago to a combined assault of Skaven and Greenskins, though they, in turn, were destroyed by the mighty dragon named Grog the Terrible. Now known as Karak Azgal, or Horde Peak, there lies 2 potential unique buildings to make here for those brave enough to capture it. The Horde of Grog. An evil drake of horrific power, Grog slew all within the hold and sniffed out its immense stores of hidden treasures, piling it all into a massive hoard of gold and jewels. Eventually, he was slain in his sleep by the dwarven hero Skalf Dragonslayer, but the treasure remains mostly untouched for those brave enough to claim it. For the actual attributes, this building should simply provide a massive income bonus to, of course, represent the absurd amount of treasure contained within the hold. To make things more interesting, it could also come with a debuff to public order to represent the danger still lurking within the depths of the hold, for those seeking to claim the dragon's hoard. In addition, this building should be available to the dwarves and Skaven, not just the Greenskins. And the second building we already talked about being the Squatter King's throne. Moving on. Deep in the Drakewald Forest, north of Altdorf, lies one of the most dangerous locations in the entirety of the Empire. Known to those aware of it as the Black Pit, it's an impressively dark series of caves and pits full of some of the most colossal spiders to be found in the old world. A truly terrifying amount of forest goblins reside here to worship them, to the extent that this could be considered the racial capital of the forest goblins. The Black Pit should be a greenskin-only unique building found in one of the 2 minor settlements in Midland, as they're the closest to its true location, which, if you play the Beastman solo campaign that you got with the Beastman race pack, the Black Pit is actually a legitimate settlement on that map. Alternatively, and much preferred, adding it in as a settlement to function either like Muslin or Hell Pit would be amazing. Which, just to clarify the difference, for those not aware, a Muslin add would be to add the Black Pit as a minor settlement of Midland, so it would count as one of its 4 settlements. But it starts off with a max tier settlement and powerful army with a max tier garrison, while a Hell Pit add would be adding a single settlement capital. So basically you'd have Midland, and then in those forests north of Carroburg, you would just have a brand new province that would just be the Black Pit, and it'd just be there by itself, and it's its own capital, just like Hell Pit, Skaven Blight, or, you know, any of the Wood Elf settlements. I actually think that would be super amazing, and would actually give the Greenskins a very strong place to try and capture in the, you know, kind of near the one of the edges of the Empire, and would really encourage, you know, Skarsnik to go north, or any of the other Greenskins to try and, you know, make deals with them or capture that settlement. As for the actual traits of the Black Pit unique structure, which you should be able to build either in the Black Pit settlement or in one of those minor settlements, it should add a recruitment rank to all spider units in addition to reducing their global upkeep. At the very least. Feel free to do more than that. In a similar vein to the Black Pit, another good forest goblin spot would be in Mount Arachnos. As the name implies, this barren peak is home to deep caves that are home to supposedly the largest arachnaroks in the entire world. Occasionally, they leave their dark caves to attack the Tomb Kings and Southland's lizardmen to devastating effect. For the unique structure here in the Mount Arachnos settlement, I would give a building called Shrine of the Spider God that perhaps could give a local poison buff to armies fighting in that region that are allied, or it could simply increase the ranks or stats of spider units and increase Untainted in the area to represent worshipping the many-eyed god. Something along those lines. To the frigid north of the Empire, there lies essentially a no man's land known by most civilized folk as Troll Country. Swarming with greenskin tribes, monsters, and of course a rather concerning number of trolls, any Waaagh who managed to capture the area would find themselves quite bolstered by the horrid creatures roaming there. This is also the original stomping grounds of Azhag before he infamously found the crown of sorcery in maze-like caverns below that frozen land. For this settlement, the Troll Country settlement, I would suggest a unique greenskin structure called Monster Dens with a Z, or something similar like to that, which would increase the ranks of trolls and giants recruited from there. Perhaps it could also reduce the recruitment time of trolls and giants by a single turn. Also, it would be a fun idea to have it cause public order penalties to adjacent provinces, as the monsters go a-stomping all over everybody's business. Could be a really interesting place for the Greenskins to seek out. In the midst of the World's Edge Mountains, there resides one of the richest mines in the entire world. Also being the only known source of the famous dwarf gem known as Brindras, it's a hotly contested hold between the various underground races. The dominant force here is Night Goblins, belonging to the Red Eye tribe, whose capital is actually much further north up in Red Eye Mountain, which we discussed earlier but we'll be discussing further in a moment. The final fun fact about Mount Gunbad is that it was featured as the first major dungeon players would encounter in the MMORPG Warhammer Online Age of Reckoning. On top of creating an appropriate unique structure here for the Greenskins, I believe it would be lovely to also toss in a reference to the beloved Warhammer RPG. Thus, for the unique structure in Mount Gunbad, I would recommend one of the wings of the old dungeon, called the Squig Nursery. Gunbad, in that alternate universe, contained a horrific monstrosity known as Ard to Feed as the final boss, a massive two-headed squig. So, this would be a fitting tribute and an excellent structure for any squig-loving Greenskin player. The Squig Nursery should provide 2 to 3 units of squigs to the Gunbad garrison, add recruitment ranks, and a small global stat buff for upkeep reduction as the quality of squigs is improved. Of course, feel free to make it even better than that if you'd like. Further north than Mount Gunbad, which you can guess where we're going, and even further than Karakadrin, can be found the Night Goblin infested region known by most as Red Eye Mountain. Once known as Karak Ungur, this deep hold is considered the capital of the immense Red Eye Night Goblin tribe, and is featured as a crucial staging ground for many Waaaghs. Both Azhag and Grimgore received major support and resources from Red Eye Mountain, with Azhag being gifted his fierce wyvern Skull Muncha, while Grimgore lived there for quite some time. The Red Eye Gobbos, for their part, are surprisingly diplomatic for Greenskins, especially Night Goblins. They also seem to have surprising skill when it comes to taming monstrous denizens of the Northern Realms, perhaps influenced by their ongoing wars with Clan Moors over in nearby Hellpit. Beyond having Azhag moved here for his starting location, I'd recommend adding the following unique structure. To represent the nefarious dealings of the Red Eye tribe, I would suggest a unique structure for the Greenskin tribes we can call the Red Eye Fort. This should probably be a lower level structure that adds more Night Goblins to the garrison and increases the recruitment rank for Night Goblin units. Unfortunately, the only way I can think to have the structure represent the Red Eye's apparent skill at capturing and training wyverns would be to add a recruitment rank to locally recruited lords. Alternatively, this building could just provide a global buff to leadership and melee attack of Night Goblins or severe upkeep reduction or what have you. But it should be something that, would start at level 1, kind of like the Slayer Shrine starts at level 1 in Karakadrin. It could even have multiple levels, if you wanted it to represent maybe different tiers of Night Goblin society. Plus, it would be a really hotly contested spot between Azhag and good old Skarsnik. At the very southern tip of the Badlands, there lies a series of massive idols to Gork and Mork, smeared with crude orc glyphs by the savage orcs of those wastelands. These tribalistic offerings create a magic barrier that was designed to keep out the dead-uns, as the orcs call them, as the superstitious savage orcs aren't terribly fond of the Tomb King's legions. I would place the barrier idols in Gorgazan, which is the closest to that border of the Badlands and Nehekara. The idol's unique structure should add a massive untainted bonus to the area, and give plus ranks to shamans to represent the considerable Waaagh energy that resides there. In addition, it should provide a leadership debuff to all undead in the southern Badlands province, to really represent the brutal cunning and cunning brutality of Gork and Mork. Moving on to the Dragonback Mountains lays the ruins of the once great mine of Ekrend. Known in modern days as Mount Bloodhorn by men and greenskins alike, it has remained a powerful stronghold of the orcs. They have fortified it with their concerning excuse for engineering, and to this day still reap piles of loot from the mine's deep vaults and tunnels. The unique structure I would recommend for the Greenskins in Ekrend is the Gates of Mount Bloodhorn, which should provide substantial siege buffs to Ekrend of plus ammunition and leadership to defenders. In addition, it should grant a decent income bonus as the Greenskins enjoy all the bottomless wealth taken from the stunties so long ago. Plus, since it's Wurzag's starting location, could be a nice buff. And if the siege buffs were adequate, it could just replace the typical siege tree. Heading even further south, one of the most contested landmarks by the Greenskins is a rocky defile known as Death Gorge. Its name comes from the fact that countless Greenskin tribes have warred over this spot for its sheltering caves that serve as an excellent camp for even the largest of tribes. The battlefield is littered with massive piles of greenskin bones and endless torn standards, marking all those tribes who died defending or attacking the gorge. For the unique structure in Death Gorge, which is a settlement, I would recommend the Tribal Fightin' Grounds, once again with a Z, as a Greenskin exclusive building, as whoever owns that land is obviously the Dead Artist tribe in the area, and they should have a considerable leadership bonus in the province. It should also provide a solid increase to income, as to whoever owns this region has virtually endless loot to choose from. Moving a little ways north, I'm not going to wax too much on this as I spoke at length about it in the Future of the Dwarves video, but I would strongly recommend adding a new settlement to the Zufbar province, the legendary flooded hold of Cragmere. Deep within its depths, in the darkness, resides a truly terrifying number of trolls. They are one of the major forces preventing the Skaven or dwarves from truly claiming the fallen hold, such is their number. But if a Greenskin tribe could take the area, they'd have a considerable boost by making use of these monsters. As either a unique structure for the Greenskins to be placed in the new minor settlement, or just attached onto one of the near minor settlements already in Zufbar, I would offer the unique structure called the Depths of Cragmere. This structure should very simply reduce the global upkeep for all trolls, and perhaps some other buffs just for them. Heading back towards the center of the Badlands, there's actually a rather unfortunate landmark near Bitterstone Mine known as the Stinking Geysers. As the name would imply, these rancid geysers vomit out a horrific stench that makes them a surprisingly defensible location for those creatures able to ignore the odor, like Greenskins, mostly goblins. The unique structure of the Stinking Geysers should be placed within Bitterstone Mine, available for the Greenskin tribes. It's one of the few locations controlled by regular goblins, and as such should provide a global recruitment rank bonus and perhaps some stat buffs to just the regular goblins and sneaky stabbas. Note, just to make sure I'm clear, that when I say regular goblins, I literally mean the 300 cost Goblin Spear, just basic unit. It should also provide a recruitment rank to goblin big bosses that you hire there. Finally, I would have the Stinking Geysers penalize attacking enemies on the settlement to represent the horrid odor, either their leadership or melee attack. Crossing back to the southern World's Edge Mountains is a rather legendary Greenskin landmark known as Misty Mountain. Now, the actual mountain itself isn't particularly famous for any physical reason. Rather, its fame comes from the infamous warboss who hailed from there. Grom the Paunch, slayer of stunties, oomies, and pointy ears, had his humble beginnings there. Though his full title was a rather long-winded Grom the Paunch of Misty Mountain, as the fattest goblin ever known, wanted the world to know where he was from. The days of the Goblin Warboss have long since passed into legend, but some speak of how he still lurks somewhere within the Minty Mountain to this day, waiting for an opportunity to begin Waaagh once again. Being the birthplace and origin of the legendary Paunch himself, the Misty Mountain Greenskins hold tight to his legacy of riding a wolf chariot into battle. The Lair of Grom should be a unique structure that provides the Greenskin tribes with a recruitment rank bonus to all chariot units. That would probably suffice. Maybe a small further bonus to local or global goblins as they're spurred on by the fat warboss's memory. Another minor settlement I would like to see added, but this time to the province of Perovan, is Massive Orcal. Contained in that isolated mountain range right smack in the middle of Bretonnia, there's basically this Greenskin collection of orcs that live within those mountains. So I'm basically suggesting the exact same thing I said with the black bits. Either this structure could be placed in one of the Bretonnian settlements that's in Paravon, so that the Greenskins are encouraged to go there and take it and build this unique structure, or, preferably, they should add a new settlement, like basically just attach it onto those mountains. Either attach it onto the bottom, or, you know, have it put into the mountain. Which Massive Oracle, just like the Black Pit, is also something that a settlement that appears in the minor campaigns, story campaigns. But this one is in the Wood Elf one. It's the Greenskins that you can fight that are in the center of Bretonnia. It'd be really awesome to put them there because Bretonnia is supposed to have an extensive orc problem. But right now, the only really orc issue they have, you have the... I think it's... I forget what their name is, but there's a tribe that starts up north that Lewin kills immediately. There's Skarsnik, who almost always goes east or south, never west. And then there's the tribe that Belegar pretty much will wipe out just to get his first province. So right now, there's not really any orcs that are significant or interesting in Bretonnia. So if they added a new settlement, being Massive Oracle, which could either, once again, be its own unique province right there, and just be a full-tier settlement, just like Skaven Blight or Hellpit, that is very tanky, and its goal is just to survive and occasionally send out Greenskin raids. Or you make it a minor settlement that is added on to the Paravon province, but it starts with a max-tier garrison and some armies that just run around stomping everything. It would be fascinating and much more interesting, and would make Bretonnia actually have an orc problem, which would be much more exciting, and would add another race to deal with when you're playing either a Wood Elf, Bretonnia, or Belegar campaign. As for the unique structure of Massive Oracle, it should increase the leadership of local Greenskins and add ranks to recruited orc units. Alternatively, it could just provide a bonus against Bretonnian armies, as the orcs found here are well versed in crumping them hoomies and their water hag. The final, thank God, possible unique structure I'll be pitching today is the burial tomb of Greenskins the Magnificent. It should be placed in one of the settlements near Quenelles. Which exact one isn't terribly important, but it would give the Greenskins, especially Skarsnik, an actual reason to go west against the Bretonnians besides the possible implementation of Massive Oracle. As one may deduce, Gruntsnik was a rather terrifying orc who raided the lands of Bretonnia and led his tribes on a merry good time until finally being put down by chivalrous knights. However, so beloved was the Warboss that the Greenskins actually bothered to construct a burial mound in honor of him, which is incredibly rare of orcs to do and speaks volumes. Ever since those ancient times, the tomb honoring a champion of Gork and Mork has remained, guarded by pious orcs and goblins against any who seek to claim or remove it. I believe, if my memory is correct, that it's actually one of the battlefields that features in one of Azhag's storylines, the one where he has to fight Bretonnians. The unique structure of Gruntsnik the Magnificent's tomb, or mound, should provide a massive untainted bonus to the province. In addition, as it's an inspiring monument to orcish might, it could provide a powerful but simple +1 or 2 ranks to lords recruited globally. This would make it a very high prize for any true Greenskin player. Alright, so the final thing I'm going to talk about in the FreeLC section is the Waaagh mechanic. First, and by Waaagh mechanic I mean the campaign Waaagh mechanic, not the in-battle Waaagh mechanic. First, let's start with how it currently functions in Mortal Empires. Right now, Greenskins have a fightiness meter that ranges from 1 to 100. At a basic level, you lose, so not doing anything, you lose 1 fightiness per turn as your troops descend into animosity. Raiding stance will add +3, and victories or losses will add or detract. At below 40 fightiness, unruly stance begins, which causes attrition, with below 20 fightiness being quarrelsome, which causes severe attrition. while above 80 fightiness begins a Waaagh, so long as you have 17 units in the parent army. A Waaagh army is an AI-controlled force usually consisting of 20 randomized units of varying degree led by a random level 1 lord. It usually copies the stance of the parent army and follows it around, joining in sieges if the player is willing to delay a turn. However, it has a notable list of downsides. The first is that Waaagh and Brayherd armies are absolutely terrible at auto-resolving, even if they have amazing armies. A Reddit post recently looked into this, and it seems the game codes these armies as minor factions. So if they go up against enemy major factions or playable factions, they just get absolutely destroyed. This makes them pretty useless unless the player is able to control them in a battle. But before we even get to battles, we have some other pit stops. The second issue with a Waaagh is that the army doesn't listen or follow orders very well. Often it tends to wander and attack the nearest enemy, regardless of if you wish it to or not. It makes a pretty terrible ally and is unreliable at best, only truly helpful if attacking an enemy settlement that you've laid siege to already, or if you just park yourself next to the only enemy in the area and hope he attacks them. Without being babysitted by the player, it's a completely useless mechanic and army. Though even if you babysit it, it will gladly disobey orders just to attack the nearest enemy just out of your reinforcement range and proceed to get absolutely murdered. That leads us to the third problem, which is that when a Waaagh takes damage, either from auto-resolving against an enemy army or taking a few punches under player control during a fight, it does not replenish troops at a reasonable rate and it won't recruit new units. If your Waaagh is damaged, you're better off suiciding it into an enemy so maybe you can get a new one. Fourthly, when the Waaagh inevitably dies, it causes a pretty major debuff to the fightiness meter called the post-Waaagh blues. This is likely to force the system from immediately respawning a new Waaagh, but it can be severely punishing for a subpar suicidal force dying, as it can just drop your fightiness meter quite a bit. Fifthly, the Waaghs force the Greenskin player to be aggressive, even though the Greenskins don't have any great healing mechanics or a way to sustain constant conquest. The reason I say that is when you conquer a settlement and have to rest to heal and recruit, for instance, the Waaagh will immediately proceed to enter raiding stance and merrily try to steal your loot and cause pretty significant public order problems. Plus, the thing with the Waaagh is that it wants you to keep going, get aggressive. Because if you just sit there, it'll just leave. It'll just vanish. But the problem is that you can't as Greenskins. They don't have any notable healing when they sack or raise or take a settlement. They don't have any healing abilities for any of their lords. And plus, Greenskins have terrible public order problems. They have one of the worst public order problems of most factions in the game. It's like a notable mechanic of theirs, is that their public order sucks. So you can't just rampage across the map grabbing a bunch of settlements, because they're all just gonna rebel and collapse, even on fairly easy difficulties. But you can't also just charge through raising and sacking everything, because then you won't be able to replenish any of your troops. It's kind of just a two-edged sword where both sides suck. So, we've identified the main issues with the Greenskins Waaagh, which, being their main mechanic, is a pretty substantial concern. Now, obviously, the difficulty here is that I'm going to propose solutions and just hope they're actually implementable. It's possible these may be easy to do, but as I've said many times during these future of videos, these are merely ideas to get discussion going and have the ball rolling. Hopefully the Greenskin campaign can be fixed with tweaks and edits rather than like a full rework, which is what's going to happen with the Wood Elves, but we'll cross that road when we get to it. So let's begin. How can we make Waaghs more meaningful, exciting, and tie it in better as an actual campaign mechanic? Let's begin with some of the easier small ideas and go from there. Firstly, if the Waaagh army must be controlled by the AI as an allied force, it needs a bit of juicing up. The random unit selection isn't too big of a deal, though the numbers that determine how many of what units are selected could use some tweaking, because you can end up with like some pretty bizarre numbers. The major small change, or most important small change, I would like to see would be that whenever a Waaagh army spawns, the Lord leading the Waaagh army is the same level as the parent army. If it was possible to go further with this idea and be able to choose your Lord from a small pool, each having different specializations. So maybe you'd be picking between like a magic heavy Goblin Great Shaman, or a beefy Wyvern minded Orc Boss, or a leadership buff focused Night Goblin Warboss. So you would have like a little list of like Waaagh only characters, and instead of like a trait, it would be like, this is how they're spec'd out, this is how they're spec'd out. And that way you could have a little bit of customization over how your Waaagh works and a little bit of control. That would be amazing, but I suspect that's not possible. At the very least, though, I hope it is possible to just have the Lord that appears be the same rank as the Lord's army he spawned from. Because getting a level 1 Lord to follow you around just sucks. Moving on to a much more significant change, the fightiness meter needs to have additional effects added to it to make it more interesting and impactful. Currently, there are 4 tiers we discussed earlier that just don't do much rather than grant a Waaagh or give you attrition. To improve upon this, I would recommend adding a series of additional attributes to each of the 4 tiers. Once again, these are only suggestions, I'm not saying like this is what needs to be done, I'm just spitballing. For the lowest tier, which is Quarrelsome, in addition to severe attrition, the Greenskin army in question should suffer penalties by starting off any battles as exhausted, as they were warring among themselves without pause prior to the fight. This would make it much more impactful and allow this tier to affect both the campaign and the battle map. I wouldn't recommend any other debuffs than that, because starting off a battle exhausted is pretty brutal. For the second to lowest tier, which is Unruly, in addition to normal attrition, the Greenskin should start off any battle they engage in as tired. This will accurately represent the Greenskins feuding among one another, but still being contained to at least mount a moderate assault on the enemy. The Cowed tier, which is the largest tier, it's between the 40 and the 80, and often the one players will be sitting in unless they're stringing together victories or suffering from recent defeats. As this stance represents the Warboss or Great Shaman preventing animosity among his troops, it should afford a small bonus as the Greenskins are organized, for orcs and goblins anyway. To represent this, I would recommend a small leadership bonus to the army, something like +5, and maybe a small recruitment price reduction. So you may be saying to yourself at this point, those 2 bottom tiers seem pretty damn punishing for essentially, when you're already being kicked. But the reason I suggest them to be so harsh is because the Waaagh should be amazing. So now we're on to the big time. Earning and maintaining a Waaagh should offer some pretty extensive bonuses to the army responsible, and truly make all other factions tremble with fear. So beyond creating an allied Waaagh, it should provide considerable bonuses as the Greenskins gather into an unstoppable horde. On the campaign map, this should provide a notable casualty replenishment bonus and recruitment price reduction as constant orcs and goblins flock to your banner. For in battle, I would recommend a buff to the army's leadership of about maybe +10, and a minor buff to weapon damage to represent the Greenskins at their full strength. Chop us out, lads, it's fighting time! The final thing to talk about in the FLC update, which I'm still going with the Waaagh thing here, is a rather important bonus that I would like to add to it. One thing I aspire to, when possible, is to add a unique way that each faction pursues interracial diplomacy. especially Confederation. Bretonnia pursues it through their tech tree. Norsca seeks diplomacy through defeating rival leaders in battle. So what's a possible way to hand this over to the Greenskins? Most people seem to think that the Greenskins should simply have the Norscan mechanic, but Greenskin politics are a tad more complicated than that. Strength of arms isn't all that matters to orcs and goblins. Being brutally cunning and cunningly brutal is far more respected. When any tribe attempts to get others to join them, killing the weaker tribe's warboss in a fight often isn't enough. His second in command will take up the fight, and the cowed tribe will often plan some backstabbing. This path is also slow, gathering up one group at a time by bashing their leaders. The real way to gather all the lads is with a right and proper Waaagh. The mightier the Waaagh under a tribe, the more they'll gather to their banner. Orcs and goblins alike will flood in from all over, eager to be on the winning team's side. So in game, I would recommend trying to implement a system similar to this. Every Waaagh that you spawn should add a diplomatic bonus with other Greenskin factions, like a nice plus 10. However, should you have a higher power ranking, positive diplomacy, and more Waaghs than this other Greenskin faction, it should grant a massive bonus to Confederation, like borderline, just a guaranteed Confederation, so you can absorb them into your Waaagh to rampage across the world. This is of course just an idea or suggestion, but regardless of how it's done, I believe the most awesome and thematic way to make things orky would be to tie Greenskin diplomacy heavily around how many Waaghs the Greenskin tribe player has going. Before we get into the DLC faction, I just want to make a note. In previous Future of videos, I have spent a fair amount of time offering up potential rights for Game 1 factions. But for this video and future videos relating to Game 1 races, I'm no longer going to do that. I believe CA has made it very, very clear that they don't intend on adding rights for any Game 1 factions, and I'm alright with that, so long as they continue to pursue new mechanics for these Game 1 factions, like how the dwarves, for instance, received their very enjoyable runecrafting system. So long as they make sure they all have a unique flair, I honestly don't think rights are required for the Game 1 factions, and that's fine to keep them as something unique for Game 2. Just wanted to put that out there. So let's go ahead and move on to DLC. Over 10,000 words later, we finally made it to the final stretch. Future ideas for full-fledged DLC. As a reminder, these are the ideas that would require new assets for the most part, and would fit better as part of a lore or campaign pack focused on Greenskins as opposed to a simple minor change that we've discussed with all that crap earlier. I would encourage anyone listening to this to feel free to place ideas in the DLC or FreeLC category as you see fit. I cannot emphasize enough how these videos are not demands or even requests to CA, but brainstorming sessions I conduct to try and get a dialogue going on how to make a good game great. The first insane new addition to the Greenskin roster I will be looking at is the equally terrifying and hilarious Mangler Squigs. Mangler Squigs are when Night Goblins capture two great cave squigs, which are quite a bit larger than regular cave squigs, which make up the Squig Herd unit in Total War Warhammer, and chain them together with a dizzying amount of iron. On the battlefield, two goblins will be further strapped to him with very optimistic thoughts of guiding the frenzied beasts. They'll then be set loose, the two large squigs bounding forward in an alarmingly fast whirlwind of snapping jaws and whipping chains. Almost in spite of the laws of physics, the two leaping mouths try to tear at one another, their momentum building as each time one of them jumps, the other is flung forward at horrific speed, and the process just keeps getting worse and worse. The two idiotic night goblins trying to steer them are quickly torn to shreds or smashed into pulp, as the Mangler Squigs slam into enemy lines, tearing everything apart with the force of a greater demon or dragon. Easily the most devastating beast the Night Goblins can unleash, these unreliable at best creatures have caused legendary amounts of damage to the goblins and their foes alike. To make a long story short though, they're a much tougher, stronger, faster, and more persistent form of fanatics, though they start on the field rather than hiding in a unit that you then throw out. They tend to start vaguely in control, bounding towards enemy lines, but once they make contact with an enemy unit, all bets are off, and they'll continue to whirl in random directions until slain. To make things even worse, their movement is so fast and erratic that shooting them is quite difficult, adding a nice missile resistance bonus to an otherwise fairly exposed target. I have no idea if these could be successfully implemented, but if they could, truly such a unit would be hilariously amazing. Which, as an idea for how to do their kind of fanatic system, what might be cool is to have the two of them, and when they charge, they start whirling and stuff, and just give them a very easily triggered rampage mechanic. Or have it so that once they hit an enemy unit, they're just permanently rampaged, which would be pretty hilarious as they just sort of spin around the field doing damage to anybody that gets in their way. One of the easiest units to implement on this list is also quite frankly the simplest. The Goblin Spear Chukka is a rather concerning creation of the Greenskins that could be generously described as a bolt thrower. Crewed by goblins, who are the only Greenskins stupid enough to trust standing near such a poorly made contraption, these war machines launch crudely made spears that can punch through heavily armored knights and wound mighty drakes. However, being made and crewed by goblins, it's safe to say that the Spear Chukka is easily the most inaccurate weapon to ever grace the battlefields of the Warhammer world. Their true allure, though, is that they are hilariously cheap. It'd be awesome to see the Greenskins get a nice, single-target focused, armor-piercing, and anti-large war machine that's cheap as dirt, but has concerningly bad accuracy. As an aside, I've heard in some places of the world, the phrase Spear Chukka is an offensive term. So, CA, if you happen to randomly be listening to this, feel free to put the Spear Chukka in the game, but change its name to something like Goblin Spear Launcha instead of Spear Chukka to make it more appropriate. The next DLC unit, which I would really like to see, and is probably my favorite, is the Savage Orc Big Stabba. For those new to this brilliant weapon, it's literally two strong Savage Orcs that carry around a massive log-sized spear. Traditionally, it was used to hunt the ancient giant reptilian monsters of the Southlands, but in recent ages it has been equally successful at skewering knights and shanking greater demons. For this model, I would do exactly what CA did with the Grail Relic, and make it into a standalone unit that provides buffs and runs around on its own. The Big Stabba on its own should simply have a hilariously high anti-large bonus, in addition to a fairly high weapon strength, along with a charge bonus as it's at its most dangerous when thrust into the chest of any foolish enough to stand before it to Waaagh. For its local buffs, I would simply have it give a small, being +1 to +10, anti-large bonus to nearby Greenskin or Orc only if that's possible, infantry, just like how the Grail Relic buffs nearby peasants. This would make it a lovely offensive reflection of the Grail Relic. And though instead of leadership and immune psychology, it's a decent combatant and gives the Greenskins a much needed buff that they can use against all sorts of nasty monsters which Greenskins tend to struggle with. I would love to see it added, and especially just the idea of it running forward and them just shoving it violently into a Griffin Lord or something is just amazing to me. And it would really add a much needed little buff to the Greenskins, just a nice little 900 or whatever cost thing that is just like the Grail Relic, except for its offensive counterpart, and it's just crazy and fun. The final DLC unit I'll be speaking about today, I wasn't going to, but I feel like I would not be doing my job correctly if I didn't at least mention it. So, long story short, there's a chariot-type weapon of the Greenskins, manned by the small creatures called snotlings we discussed earlier. It's a very bizarre machine that only snotlings know how to build, because for some inexplicable reason, when there's enough Waaagh energy gathered, the snotlings, despite being incredibly stupid, begin to gather various pieces of junk and scrap together to make a pump wagon, which is called the snotling pump wagon. Beyond that, it's essentially just a fairly average chariot with a few notable features. Firstly, it's unbreakable and unstable, like undead, because the snotlings are too stupid to realize when they're in danger, but the pump wagon is so poorly constructed that an accidentally well-placed blow can easily cause the whole thing to just explode. The snotlings may add the following features to it though, which these things make it really interesting and might make it something that CA or the fans want pursued. A spiky roller, which as the name implies is a big damn spiked wheel in the center of the pump wagon that makes its charge way more devastating as the foe is pulped beneath. Outriggers are essentially makeshift sails of cloth that cause the pump wagon to move quite a bit faster, but make it more difficult to control. The most dangerous upgrade the snotlings like to add are giant exploding spores, which they attach to the front of the wagon that explode to horrific effect when colliding with the first foe struck at the battle. To refresh any memories, these spores are a special fungus that grow out of greenskin dung and are deadly to inhale, thus rendering armor against them completely useless. The snotling crew also carries spores which they fling out at enemies in close enough range. The final and most bizarre addition seen on some pump wagons are flappas, which are crude wings attached to the sides of the wagon and moved up and down, which allow it to make modest hops to avoid dangerous terrain and obstacles. It's a very goofy weapon, though it could be surprisingly dangerous in the days of tabletop, but, you know, I figured I would at least mention it. It would be very, very cool to see animated snotlings and see them actually have a presence on the battlefield, but, you know, it's just kind of one of those things. So with that, we are on to the final aspect of this video. It's time for the final entry in today's video. Some may be wondering, what possible DLC could be put out that would fit or allow any of the units I just discussed? And to that, I have an answer. I would recommend a Lord pack featuring none other than Grom the Paunch. For his opponent, one could easily do his ancient rival, Eltharion the Grim of the High Elves, if they wanted a Warhammer 1 versus Warhammer 2 Lord pack. Or to keep it just game 1, he could battle the Rune Lord Thoric Ironbrow we discussed in the Future of the Dwarves video, or even one of the missing Empire Lords we looked at, such as Kurt Helborg or the Mad Count Marius Leitdorf, whose final climactic story was against the Greenskin hordes. Anyway, here's Grom. For those not familiar, Grom the Paunch of Misty Mountain was a legendary goblin warboss, the likes of which the world hasn't seen before or after. He once wasn't anything particularly special, a small goblin boss of the Broken Axe tribe in the southern World's Edge Mountains. However, Grom always had a fierce appetite, which proved to be quite problematic when his gluttony overrode good sense, and he consumed some uncooked troll flesh. This was a terrible decision, as troll flesh will continue to regenerate until properly scorched. So the race was on, between stretching and digestion. Known as the Battle of the Belly to those retelling the tale, Grom grew to a truly absurd size as the foul meat kept expanding. Most creatures would have simply popped, but the paunch was made of sterner stuff. When the troll flesh finally stilled, Grom could no longer see his legs past his legendary gut, but was rather unconcerned as he was now the biggest of the lads. Quickly capturing the position of Warboss due to his increased strength and size, Grom became a true terror in the region. He would go on to tear through the lands of the dwarves, humans, and elves in the greatest goblin Waaagh ever seen. But that's a tale we'll cover in detail another day. When it comes to magical items, Grom the Paunch has two that he utilizes in battle. The first is his weapon, known as the Axe of Grom. Also called Elf Biter by some Greenskins, this weapon greatly increases Grom's strength to that of a giant, and allowed him to decapitate many foes with ease. It was also notably more dangerous against elves, seeming to worm around their defenses to strike even decapitating blows, much easier than any goblin should have been capable of. For the rules, I would simply have this weapon grant him an ability that increases his weapon strength considerably, and gives him a solid anti-infantry bonus to represent his killing blow special rule. It should grant a further anti-infantry, or melee attack bonus, against elven factions in campaign once he claims the axe. Of his two items, this one would probably work the best as a quest battle if he needed to have a quest battle. The second item possessed by Grom is his Lucky Banner. This standard gets its name mostly from the bearer of the banner, a famously lucky night goblin called Niblet. The Goblin Warboss met Niblet when he ventured to conquer the Gutstabba tribe that were the rivals of the Broken Axe back in the first year following the Grom's Belly incident. After slaying the Gutstabba's Orc Warboss and all of their big bosses in a series of challenges, the Paunch was so tired that he sat down. Unfortunately, a rather tiny night goblin was directly under Grom's bulk and vanished beneath his form as he crashed to the earth. All the Greenskins expected there to be nothing left but a black smear on the earth, but when Grom managed to shift, Niblet not only had survived, but leapt up with a maniacal grin. This impossible survival convinced Grom that the night goblin was blessed by Mork, and thus he was immediately promoted to Grom's personal standard bearer. In typical Greenskin fashion, the Lucky Banner, whipped frantically about by Niblet, is indeed actually lucky. It simply provides a 5+ ward save to both Grom and his chariot, which could easily be implemented as a simple skill or passive, which a 5+ ward save in tabletop roughly comes out to like a 10 to 15% in Total War Warhammer. When it comes to unique skills, Grom has two worthy of note. The least famous of these is his skill called Eats Elves for Breakfast. Unknown to most Total War players who did not play tabletop, in the lore and in tabletop, goblins suffer from fear when fighting elves. They're terrified of them, they smell funny. Grom, however, overcame this fear and quite enjoyed his devastating invasion of Ulthuan. He inspires all the goblins in his army to be similarly not afraid of the pointy ears. As goblins don't fear elves in Total War, this skill should then simply be put on his skill tree, and when taken provide his army with a series of buffs against all elven kind. The skill the Goblin Warboss is most famous for is Grom's Waaagh. See, in tabletop, Goblin Warbosses and even Great Shamans, both the Orc and Goblin variety, were not capable of calling a Waaagh to inspire their armies, as few Greenskins were impressed to acts of violence by such weird or diminutive leaders. Grom, however, was the exception. Larger than most orcs and incredibly mighty, the Great Un, as some called him, was just as capable of calling a Waaagh as the greatest of orcs. Due to being a goblin, he also inspired his fellow goblins with his war cry as well, instead of just the orc units, which traditionally were the only ones capable of being buffed by a Waaagh cry. To represent this buff, as Waaagh has already been upgraded in Total War Warhammer to being available for every lord choice and affects every unit, I would make Grom's Waaagh just a more powerful version. Or perhaps have it be on his skill tree that if he takes Grom's Waaagh, it just cuts the cooldown of Waaagh in half. Something like that. When it comes to mounts, Grom can either go on foot or he can ride on his chariot, which is known as Grom's Chariot. There is a note to be made there though. Grom's chariot is not a normal wolf chariot. Due to Grom the Paunch's fatness, only he and Niblet can fit on the chariot, so it has no shooting attack, and it's pulled by 3 giant wolves instead of just 2 to compensate for his absurd weight. When it comes to starting location, Grom's starting locale depends a lot on what circumstances he is added to the game in. For any of the old world matchups, I would put him where he should be, right back in his home, the Misty Mountain, which is located in the Southern Badlands. If he were to be unleashed into the new world, in like an Altharian versus Grom DLC, he could instead easily just take over the tribes of Mount Arachnos down in the Southlands, or be placed on one of the islands to the east of Ulthuan, or maybe even just take a piece of Ulthuan to start his rampage. Maybe he could start on like the northeastern side, where he's the furthest away from the elf player factions. When it comes to faction effects, Grom should be an inspiring presence for all the goblins under his rule, as he leads the Broken Axe tribe to war, which probably should be his faction name. These abilities should primarily reflect that. So I would say he should probably add a recruitment rank when recruiting all regular goblin units. So not night goblins and not forest goblin spider riders or spider rider archers, just regular goblins. So like sneaky stabbas, goblin archers, and goblins. He should also have, his faction should have a buff for chariot units, either a recruitment buff or just make them better, because Grom makes chariots look good, and he's the Greenskin Lord for chariots. The final thing is that I would give him a diplomacy bonus when dealing with other goblin-led factions. So Crooked Moon, Mutinous Gits, Black Venom, Mountain Arachnos, Red Eye, etc., etc. And then for Lord effects, I would have his only Lord effect be, Grom should give his personal army very powerful buffs against the 3 ancestral foes he devastated with his original campaign. So just some nice solid buffs to his army against dwarves, humans, or just the Empire, and of course the High Elves, or you could even make it all elves if you wanted to. The other thing worth noting about Grom, because I realized it didn't necessarily write it into this, is that because he's on a chariot, he has pretty reasonable armor, but most importantly, due to the troll flesh he consumed, Grom gained the rather uncanny ability to regenerate, exactly like a troll. So although he's of course vulnerable to fire, he regenerates at an alarming rate. He's at the point where during one of his famous duels against the Gutstabba tribe, the enemy Orc Warboss literally cleaved his axe through Grom's gut. And Grom not only kind of ignored it, but it literally stitched itself back together in a matter of seconds, and Grom proceeded to absolutely murder the enemy Warboss. So, with that, let's head into the closing. I want to take a moment to say thank you for everyone who somehow made it all the way through this video. Give me a hashtag Waaagh in chat if you were able to watch the whole video, and of course, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button if you enjoyed it, as these future of videos are very near and dear to my heart, especially since the Empire and Dwarf ones, though I will not claim this to be a fact, it seems like they helped get some interesting changes done to both of those factions. Could be it's totally unrelated, but many of the changes that were added into the game, which I believe were all positive, seem suspiciously identical to the changes I recommended. So, which is not because of me, it's because of y'all. It's because y'all show up, you watch the video, you get a lot of traction, you share it with your friends on Reddit, on the forums, you put it places, you upvote, or you like it, and you comment below and make a discussion. That alone carries a insane amount of weight, and I really appreciate you all for helping out. I also want to take a moment to thank all of my very, very generous patrons who have been very tolerant with me, especially this summer as things have been a little wild and a little crazy. I hope they enjoyed this video, and I hope you're all looking forward to a very long slot of lore videos. I do want to go ahead and say that normally we vote for the next future of video, which we're going to as well here, which the future of videos I kind of like to make more of a public thing. So feel free in the description or in the comments below to say which future of video you want next, so which race you want focused on next. Now your options are limited. you can only choose factions from game 1 right now. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you guys that I'm doing vampire counts next. And the reason I'm doing vampire counts next is because it's going to be really freaking short compared to anybody else. Because the vampire counts are in a fairly good place and need very, very minor updates. And I would like to get that out very quickly. So your options for the future of video that comes after the vampire counts is either the Beastmen, the Warriors of Chaos, or the Wood Elves, also Bretonnian. Any of those 4. So just pick which of those is your favorite, and I will be checking the comments to figure out, who wins the vote to decide which I will do after the vampire counts, just because they'll be easy, and I'd like to get them out of the way so we have the base 4 races out. With that, I don't want to talk too much longer. This video landed around 2 hours, which actually surprises me. I thought it was going to be another 30 minutes longer at least. So thank you all for watching. I can't wait to see all of your thoughts and ideas and criticisms or what have you in the description down below. So thank you all again so much for watching. I appreciate all your support, especially those of you who subscribe and hit that bell so that you get to know when I put out new videos and like the video, and of course patrons who we've already discussed. In any event, I will see you all around. Have a great night. Goodbye.